La sua situazione. Andrei ci ha dato un quadro molto chiaro della visione. È un problema di struttura sociale, quindi c'è un problema di rafforzare una struttura sociale per poter perseguire degli obiettivi di lungo periodo. Quindi questo mi pare il dato che si coniuga con la situazione europea che lui contraddistingue fra una Germania larga, quindi i paesi del nord, e dall'altra parte un sud. Io non ho capito una cosa, dove sta la Francia? Dove la mettiamo la Francia? La mettiamo su o la mettiamo giù? Elie Cohen.
Well,
Où est la France?
well, it's very interesting because usually we meet and we have a lot of disagreements at the beginning of our discussion, and at the end we find a lot of convergences. So I will try to see if it's always the same situation. Well, my first point is that we are facing the return of the constraints of the current account balance, which means very clearly that nations are back in town. And it's an effect of what I can call new post-crisis realism. Laissez-faire complacency by several governments has led to inefficient growth of non-tradable sectors at the expense of tradable sectors. The best case is the case of Spain. So we need to think about this question of how can we reach the current account balance. And when we start to think about this, you find the question of industrial policy because, 80% of the tradables goods and services are manufacturing goods and services. So you need clearly to have an industrial policy. So then the question is what the role of the nation in the industrial policy. I was very interested this morning by the exchange concerning the Chinese case. And as I have a personal experience in the telecom sector, I would like to share with you a very practical case in order to understand what does it mean clearly an industrial strategy, a successful industrial strategy versus the failure of another industrial strategy, clearly the European one. Well, of course, in China, there were general conditions which enhanced the capabilities of all the actors, namely the huge investment programs, namely the investment in human capital, namely the policy for the use of land, etc. And these are what we can call general competitive environment. And of course, the Chinese made a lot of efforts to create this favorable environment. But if you look specifically at certain sectors, like the telecom sector, and in fact there are a lot of sectors who are sharing the same characteristics, what you can see, I was in China 30 years ago, and there is no, of course, any equipment industry. There were a small thing built inside the military called the beginning of Huawei. And what have they done during the last 30 years? They had clearly a strategy to become a major player in the telecom sector. And how they achieve this objective? Well, with 4 ingredients: IP policy, procurement policy, normalization standardization policy, rules of FDI. How these characteristics had played. IP policy, well, to say the least, the rules of IP policy in China and the way IP policy were made into real terms varied across the time. We had very low enforcement rules at the beginning, and we now have more serious enforcement rules. What does it mean? It means that when you combine IP policy with FDI policy, you understand how American companies have set joint ventures at the beginning, then began to transfer the technology, then you had reverse engineering, then you had the essence of etc., etc., and at the end we had the capability to build a national capability. Second element, the standardization policy. Well, everybody thinks that the Chinese policy failed in the technology sector, especially in the telecom sector, because their national norms won't play very well. But if you think of the normalization policy as a tool favoring technology transfer, now you understand well how different foreign companies, to avoid the development of a national standard, help the Chinese to build their own industry through this transfer of technology. Then the procurement policy. Well, very strangely, China favored companies building their capabilities in China and selling their industrial products in China. This idea of a national procurement policy played a tremendous effect. And then, well, I can develop all these points. Of course, we had a true industrial policy because you had clearly a sectoral targeting. It's clear. What is ultimately an industrial policy is that you think that you can model the specialization of a country through national policies. It is clear that through these different policies, we modeled the specialization of China because 30 years ago, it was not obvious at all that China will become one of the major players in the telecom equipment, which is actually the case. Of course, there are a lot of competition inside because there were different actors who are trying to capture this market. And we have also, which is quite clear, a mercantilist policy at the global level. So if you want to understand what is an industrial strategy, you have to understand the general conditions, you have to understand the specific conditions, and you have to understand also how this strategy was deployed and succeeded over time. Now, let's turn to Europe. 20 years ago, we were the world champions in mobile technology. We invented the GSM, we had the better labs, we had the better players, etc. 20 years after, it's a total disaster. We had no longer real capabilities in the technology sector. Our major industrial actors are falling, one after the other, etc., etc. It's not necessary to draw a more precise picture. And why we face this kind of situation? Precisely for the reasons my very good friend is mentioning. We tried harder to help new entrants for the best use of consumers. So we've made all that was possible to break the old incumbents, to help the new entrants enter the market. And we succeeded in this policy. Because if I can give you the example of France, we had formerly a kind of Chinese policy, which was a Colbertist policy. In fact, we invented this kind of policy I described earlier. It's not Chinese, it's French. And this kind of policy we've invented, but we've decided 20 years ago that we have to relinquish this kind of policy and to adopt the policies developed by my very good friend. And in fact, we helped create new entrants. And if I give you just one example, do you know that today we have the lowest prices, for example, in ADSL? We have the lowest prices in mobile telephony. So for the consumers, it's a perfect success. But we are not able to invest in 4G technology because the companies have not the resources to invest in 4G technology. We don't have the capacity to invest in fiber. And the old ugly monopolists are slashing in their research equipment and they are slashing in their personnel. So we have nimble operators, but who no longer make their work as researchers.
About Minitel?
Huh?
Will you say something about Minitel?
I can, if you want, if you have 20 minutes, okay. I can develop the other policies and the past.
Very successful one?
Very successful ones, of course. Well, so the idea that by favoring new entrants, you are going to create a very innovative landscape is simply out of touch. And you can produce certain effects in terms of prices, in terms of consumer behavior, but the idea that it's the solution, I think it's not quite clear. So, 2 minutes. So, more seriously now, why the nations has still a role to play? For other very simple reasons you mentioned. The new industrial policy, it's an industrial policy who combines inputs from education, research, innovation, etc., and industry. And of course, when you think that you have a problem with your education system, you have to redesign this education system. And in fact, I don't know if you are aware, in our program in France, qui s'appelle Programme d'investissement d'avenir, Investment for the Future, we've decided that in our program of investment of 35 billion euros, the half of this money will go to university, to training centers, etc., because we have to improve our capacity in the skills and intellectual capital. That is the first point. The second point is, of course, as you mentioned, also the social model. If you can't transform the rules of the game, if you have a bias for traditional companies and you can't invest in new companies, it is very difficult. And the third, because I see that you are, the third is that we need more money to put in the system, in the innovation system, in the R&D system, in helping the SMEs, etc. And this new money, you have to find it somewhere. And of course, here also the state has to be mobilized. Just one word. We failed miserably with our Lisbon agenda, as you probably know, and even my friend will admit that we failed miserably. Nobody invested enough in R&D, in education, in smart systems, etc., etc. So if you want to invest more, of course we can cross our hands and ask for the Europeans to invest, but I don't think a lot that this is a very solution, because overall the European budget is 1% of GDP of Europe. So we have to count on national resources. So for all these reasons, and a lot of others, because I didn't have time to go through my paper, we need an intervention of the national state, especially in the context of the huge crisis we are facing now. Thank you.
Thank you.